We're going to switch gears now and spend a few minutes talking about glands. Remember, when it comes to epithelial tissue is found covering body surfaces, lining body cavities, and also in glands. So the first thing we need to talk about is what a gland is. When you hear that term gland, what it means is an individual cell or a multicellular organ that is composed primarily of epithelial tissue. And glands will make and secrete substances that are going to be used somewhere else, in other words, not in the gland, or substances that will be eliminated from the body. So that's a long and complex definition, but it basically tells us what the structure of glands are, individual cells or multicellular organs that are made out of epithelial tissue, what glands do, make and secrete substances, and how they do it. They send those substances somewhere else, or they send those substances to be eliminated from the body. Now, when it comes to the kinds of things that glands secrete, there's an amazing range of substances. Everything from mucin to various ions to different types of hormones to all different kinds of enzymes, waste products like urea. The list goes on and on and on. Now, we can categorize glands very generally as being either exocrine or endocrine. You'll notice I have a star next to exocrine because this is the one that we're going to learn the most detail about. Exocrine glands secrete all different kinds of products, but what makes them unique is that they use ducts. They use passageways called ducts to connect with the surface of the epithelial tissue. Good examples of exocrine glands are the mammary glands, salivary glands, and sweat glands. Now, endocrine glands are very different. Unlike exocrine glands, endocrine glands only secrete hormones, and they secrete those hormones directly into the blood. Endocrine glands don't have any ducts associated with them. A couple of examples of endocrine glands are the thyroid gland and the adrenal gland. Again, we're going to stay focused on exocrine glands. Now, there are lots of different types of exocrine glands, so they too have to be classified. The most basic way to classify exocrine glands is whether they are unicellular or single-celled glands or multicellular glands. Now, when it comes to the unicellular exocrine glands, they're typically found very close to the epithelial surface, so they're not very deep down into that tissue. And they're kind of the exception to the other types of exocrine glands because they don't tend to have ducts. Remember, we said, as a general rule, exocrine glands have ducts associated with them. But because these single-celled glands sit so close to the surface, they just don't need the duct. They're going to make and secrete products that are going to be released just that short distance to the surface of the epithelium. A good example of a single-celled exocrine gland is what's called a goblet cell. Goblet cells are found in the gastrointestinal tract, and they secrete a protein called mucin. It's actually a glycoprotein. It's a protein that has a small amount of carbohydrate attached to it. You can also find goblet cells in the respiratory tract secreting this mucin material. Now, for the multicellular glands, there are actually different regions to the gland. Multicellular exocrine glands have a region that we refer to as the acinus, and the plural of that is acini, and the other region, which is the duct. The acinus of a multicellular exocrine gland is the group of cells that are making the secretion that that gland produces. The ducts are the group of cells that are creating the tunnel that's going to carry that secretion out to the surface. Multicellular exocrine glands are usually surrounded by a fibrous layer of tissue that we call a capsule. And some of them are actually divided into what we call lobes, just like your lungs and your liver are divided into lobes. A good example of a multicellular exocrine gland is a sweat gland. Take a look at the drawing on this slide. This represents a multicellular exocrine gland. So the outer surface of the epithelium is represented up here at the top. Then we can see cells lining this structure right here, which is the gland. And then we can see some gray tissue surrounding it. You can also see a bright yellow line here. That represents that fibrous capsule that's sometimes found around these multicellular glands. So in this drawing, the acinus of the gland is represented by the darker purple cells, and the duct of the gland is represented by these lighter purple cells. So these cells down here in the acinus, these are the cells that are making and secreting some kind of a product molecule. And in this picture, that's represented by these little tiny gray dots. Those secreted molecules are going to be carried up through the duct out onto the surface of the epithelium. While we're looking at this image, tell me what you would call this epithelium in terms of its number of layers and the shape of the cells. Do you think this is simple or stratified? Do you think these are squamous cells, cuboidal cells, or columnar cells? What do you think? I would call this a simple epithelium because it has a single layer, and these are cuboidal cells. Now, you could argue that these cells, the way they're drawn, don't really have a perfectly square shape. They are a little rectangular. Some of them aren't rectangular at all because they go around corners. But I want you to notice the one feature that the artist has really done well, which is placed the nuclei dead in the center of the cell. This is the hallmark of cuboidal epithelium. So a simple cuboidal epithelium is making up this gland. While all multicellular exocrine glands have the same general features, there is quite a bit of variability from gland to gland in terms of the duct system and the shape of the acinus or the acini. On this slide, I've listed the different types of multicellular exocrine glands according to this other level of classification. We'll describe each one first, and then we'll take a look at them. So when it comes down to the duct system, we can describe both simple and compound multicellular exocrine glands. Simple glands have one unbranched duct associated with them, while compound glands have branched ducts. And again, we'll take a look at this in just a moment. In terms of the acinus of the gland, we could describe tubular, acenar, and tubuloacenar glands. A tubular gland means that both the acinus of the gland and the duct have the same diameter. In other words, it just looks like a plain tube, this duct. An acenar gland is different. An acenar gland has a wider acinus and a more narrow duct. Now you should know that in some source materials, Acenar glands are called alveolar glands instead. Those two words mean the same thing. And finally, there's sort of a combined version called the Tubuloacenar, which has both features present, both the tubular feature, same diameter, and acenar feature present in the same gland. Let's go back for a minute and look at the gland that we saw in the last slide. Remember, this is a multicellular gland. You can see all of the cells here that make up this gland. We would call this a simple exocrine gland because it has a single duct associated with it. We would also call it an acenar gland or an alveolar gland, again, depending on the source you're reading. And that's because the acinus is wider across than the duct is. Let's take a look at some more drawings of glands. On this slide, you can see all the different versions in one place. At the top, we can see a variety of simple glands. And at the bottom, we can see a variety of compound glands. So remember, a simple gland has a single unbranched duct, and a compound gland has a branched duct. So let's take a look at these glands. If you start right here on the top left, you're looking at a gland that has a very basic structure. As you look down the length of the gland, it's really hard to tell the difference between the acinus and the duct. Everything has the same diameter all the way down. All right, so this would be referred to as a simple tubular gland. It's simple because it has a single duct that is not branched, and it's tubular because the acinus is the same diameter as the duct is. Make sense? Now, over here, we also have a simple tubular gland, but this one is branched. It's not the duct that's branched. It's the acini that are branched. In other words, there's one duct here, and there are 3 acini. So this is still simple because there's one unbranched duct, and it's still tubular because the acini and the duct have the same diameter. Over here, this is a sort of a version of a simple tubular duct. This is referred to as a coiled duct because, as the diagram shows you, instead of being a linear structure, it has twists and turns associated with it. You'll see this when we talk in more detail about sweat glands. Now this image right here represents a simple acinar gland. It's simple because there's one unbranched duct, but it's the acenar or alveolar type because the acinus is wider than the duct is. Now a version of that would be a simple acenar gland that is branched. Now it's not the duct that's branched, it's the acini There are multiple acini with a single duct. Now take a look at the bottom of the slide that represents different types of compound glands. In compound glands, you're going to see branching of the duct, and you may or may not have branching of the acinus. So in the first drawing over here on the left, we have what's called a compound tubular gland. It's compound because the duct is branched. Can you see that? Here's the main part of the duct, and then we've got 1, 2, 3 branches coming off. You can tell that you're not to the acinus yet, because when you get down to the acinus, that is also branched out. Now this is a tubular type because the diameter in the acinus and the diameter in the ducts is the same. In comparison, this would be a compound Acenar gland or a compound alveolar gland. It's compound because the duct is branched, and it's acenar or alveolar because the acinus or the acini look like circles here. They're wider than the duct is. See over here, they almost look like fingers. They're longer and straighter acini. Over here, they're wider and rounder acini. Finally, we have what you could argue is the most complex type of multicellular exocrine gland, which is the compound Tubuloacenar gland. This gland is compound because the duct system is branched. And it's called Tubuloacenar because it has features of both types in the acini. So we can classify multicellular exocrine glands in a number of different ways. There's an additional classification that we need to be familiar with, and this is the classification that involves the method of secretion. In other words, all of these multicellular exocrine glands are producing and secreting some kind of material that's going to be sent out onto the surface of the epithelium. But the method of secretion can vary. There are 3 types that we should be familiar with. What's called Merocrine secretion, what's called Apocrine secretion, and what's called Holocrine secretion. Let's start with Merocrine. What a Merocrine gland does is package up the secretions that it makes into little vesicles, like transport vesicles. And it will release those vesicles from the cells using a process called exocytosis. It's just going to send those vesicles out into the space of the gland. The cells that make the secretion and the cells that send the vesicles out through exocytosis, they're going to remain intact. Nothing bad is going to happen to them as they send these little vesicles out. Now, good examples of Merocrine type glands are Lacrimal glands that make your tears, the salivary glands, some of the sweat glands, but not all, some of the glands in your pancreas, and some of the glands in your stomach. Now, there is one term here I want you to take note of. That's this term eccrine. We're going to come back to this term when we talk more about the skin. But what an eccrine gland is, specifically, is a type of sweat gland that falls into the merocrine group. Let me say that again because that can be confusing. There are sweat glands called eccrine glands. They are the type of sweat gland that falls into the merocrine group. Next on the list is apocrine. Apocrine glands are going to suffer a little bit of damage as they secrete the material that they're producing. The apical ends of the epithelial cells in these types of glands are actually going to pinch off, carrying the secretion inside. And that is what gets released into the space in the duct. So, in other words, the cells that are making this type of secretion, the cells are going to lose their apical ends. Remember, there's an apical surface to an epithelial cell and a basal surface. So literally, a whole region of this cell is going to break away, carrying the secretion with it. A good example of apocrine glands are the mammary glands that are producing and secreting milk. Also, the ceruminous glands, the glands that make the waxy material in your ears. Some sweat glands are this apocrine type of gland. Finally, there are holocrine types of exocrine glands. Holocrine glands suffer the most damage during secretion. In a holocrine gland, the cells that are making the secretion are going to make more and more and more of it till they have lots of it present. And then the cell itself is going to disintegrate so that the secretion gets released, the material gets released. A good example of a holocrine type gland is the type of gland referred to as a sebaceous gland in your skin. These are the glands that secrete the oily material, for example, around your hair follicles. Now, on this slide, we're looking at the different methods of secretion that we see in exocrine glands. On the left-hand side, there's a representation of a merocrine type gland. In the middle, there's an apocrine type gland. And over on the right, there's a holocrine type gland. The artist has shown us examples of where these glands are found as well. For example, the salivary glands are this merocrine type. And remember, in a merocrine type of gland, these cells that line the acinus are going to make and secrete their material, in this case, saliva. The cells are going to produce the saliva, then they're going to package it up into little vesicles, and they're going to release those vesicles into the space through exocytosis. The cells themselves are not being damaged. This is sort of a purposeful secretion of material. You can see the little vesicles in the space in the gland. They're represented by these little blue circles. And those will be carried up and released into the mouth as saliva. Now, the mammary gland is an example of an apocrine gland. And in an apocrine gland, the cells that are producing the secretion are going to be physically damaged when they release the secretion. The entire apical end of each cell is going to be broken off so that the secretion can be released. And you can see in this image, the artist has drawn the secretion, the milk, as these little white droplets. So these cells are physically damaged. Their apical ends are being torn away so that the milk can be released. Now, on the left-hand side, we're reminded that sebaceous glands are of the holocrine type. Sebaceous glands are the type of glands that are found in your skin and other places that secrete an oily substance. In a holocrine gland, the cells that make the secretion down in the acinus are going to build up and build up and build up that secretion to a point when the cell itself will then just disintegrate so that the secretion gets released. And in this drawing, the secretion is the oil. You can see the artist has drawn in all these little pieces of cell. These cells, shown here and here and here, are just stuffed with oil. And they are literally going to just disintegrate so that the oil can be released up to the surface.